I want you to think about a question that has haunted me for a long time. What if someone told you with absolute clarity that a disaster was coming, but you just couldn't bring yourself to believe them? Not because they weren't credible, but because believing them would force you to change everything about how you see the world. It would mean admitting that your priorities were wrong, that your friends were actually your enemies, and that the comfortable distance you thought you had from a faraway conflict was a complete illusion. What would that do to you? In the spring of 2001, a man stood before the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He wasn't a head of state in a nice suit. He was a military commander from a country most people in the West couldn't point to on a map. His name was Ahmad Shah Massoud, and he carried with him a message so urgent, so specific, that you'd think it would have triggered every alarm bell in Washington and Paris. He said that Osama bin Laden was preparing a massive strike against the United States. He didn't just have a hunch. He had spent years fighting the very network that was planning it. He was the last line of defense, standing in the mountains of Afghanistan with his forces against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And yet, just 5 months later, on September 9th, 2001, he was assassinated by two Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists. 2 days after that, the world watched the Twin Towers fall. That timing has never sat right with me. It's too precise. It's too coordinated. The question I keep coming back to isn't just what happened, but why. Why was his warning essentially ignored? Why did the United States and its allies, including France, look the other way? The easy answer is to blame intelligence failures, but I think it's more complicated. I think it has to do with money, with realpolitik, and with a kind of willful blindness that happens when a potential ally doesn't fit the neat boxes we've created for them. We have to go back and look at who Massoud was, what he was fighting against, and who was really pulling the strings in the region. Before we begin, this video is an educational and analytical discussion of geopolitical events. It reflects analysis and opinion based on publicly available information and does not promote violence, hate, or extremist ideologies. To understand the tragedy of that ignored warning, you have to understand the man delivering it. Massoud wasn't just another warlord, although depending on who you ask, that description gets murky. He was a Tajik from the Panjshir Valley, a natural military strategist who earned the nickname the Lion of Panjshir by successfully resisting the Soviet Red Army during the occupation of the 1980s. While the Soviets, with all their advanced technology and firepower, couldn't crack the valley, Massoud held them off. That alone gave him a legendary status. But after the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, and the communist regime in Kabul crumbled a few years later, Afghanistan didn't find peace. It imploded. A brutal civil war erupted between the various Mujahideen factions who had once fought a common enemy. And this is where the narrative gets complicated. From 1992 to 1996, Massoud's forces were part of a government that controlled Kabul, but it wasn't a peaceful era. It was a time of chaotic infighting. There are credible reports, documented by organizations like Human Rights Watch, that during this period, various factions within the Northern Alliance, including some aligned with Massoud, committed serious human rights abuses. There are accounts of rape, summary executions, and indiscriminate shelling of the city. I have to sit with that. It's a stark reminder that in war, the side that eventually becomes the good guy in a narrative often has blood on its hands. Massoud himself was a complex figure, an Islamist, but one that many Western journalists and diplomats who met him described as moderate and visionary. He reportedly wanted an inclusive, multi-ethnic government for Afghanistan, but his recent history in Kabul meant that when he later came to the West asking for help, there were people who remembered the destruction of the early 90s. They saw him not as a savior, but as part of the problem. Then in 1996, a new force swept through Afghanistan and changed the calculus for everyone: the Taliban. The Taliban emerged from the chaos. They were primarily Pashtun, students from religious seminaries or madrasas, many of which were located across the border in Pakistan. And this is the first major thread that often gets underreported: the degree to which Pakistan was the architect of the Taliban's rise. You have to understand Pakistan's strategic paranoia. They've always feared being trapped between two hostile powers: India to the east and a potentially hostile Indian-allied Afghanistan to the west. Their doctrine of strategic depth meant they wanted a pliant, friendly government in Kabul. In the 90s, they decided the Taliban was their best bet. Pakistan funneled weapons, fuel, and money to the Taliban. They saw it as a way to control Afghanistan by proxy. But as anyone who has dealt with proxies knows, sometimes the puppet cuts its own strings. The Taliban weren't just some Pakistani creation. They were ideologically driven, extreme, and brutal. When they captured Kabul, they publicly hanged former President Najibullah and his brother. They imposed a draconian version of Sharia law. Women were erased from public life, forbidden from working or going to school, forced to wear the burqa. I remember reading accounts of the so-called religious police beating women in the streets with metal-studded leather batons for showing an inch of ankle. It was a regime of absolute control. One diplomat stationed in Kabul at the time relayed a story that always stuck with me. He talked about how the Taliban were invited to Islamabad for peace talks. They stayed in a guest house, and the next morning, a female UN official came down, looking exhausted. It turned out the pious Taliban delegation in the next room had been watching pornography until 4 in the morning. It was a small human moment that completely punctured the image of ascetic purity they tried to project. It showed that underneath the ideology, there were just men with power, and like many men with absolute power, they were deeply hypocritical. By the time the dust settled, the Taliban controlled about 90% of the country. Massoud and his Northern Alliance were cornered in the northeastern mountains, the last holdouts. It was in this context from 1996 onwards that Massoud began trying to warn the world. He saw that the Taliban wasn't just a local problem. He saw the foreigners in their ranks, the Arabs, the Chechens, the Uzbeks. He saw al-Qaeda turning his country into a launching pad for global jihad. So, how do you warn a world that doesn't want to listen? Massoud was in a brutally difficult position. He was fighting a losing war, his supplies were running out, and he was up against an enemy that had the full backing of a neighboring state with a nuclear arsenal, Pakistan. He knew he needed help, and he knew he had something to offer: intelligence. There's a specific memory from a former French intelligence officer who was on the ground with Massoud. He describes Massoud as sharp, not a fool. The French intelligence services, like the CIA, were in contact with him. They met him regularly. Why? Because Massoud had an extensive network of informants inside Taliban and al-Qaeda territory. He was a goldmine of information on Osama bin Laden. The French officer acted as a messenger, feeding information back to Paris. So the intelligence was flowing. It was being heard at some levels, but it never translated into political or military support. And I think there are a few reasons for that. First, there's the Pakistan factor. Pakistan was and is a major client of the United States and its allies. They were a key player in the region, a counterweight to India. The U.S. had invested billions in Pakistan. Arms sales, economic aid, diplomatic cover. To truly help Massoud would have meant directly confronting Pakistan, cutting off the head of the snake that was funding the Taliban. That would have been a massive geopolitical shift. According to former French Minister Alain Madelin, when he tried to get the French government to engage with Massoud, he was told by a senior official that they couldn't risk it because of arms negotiations with Pakistan. That's the cold calculus of real politics. You don't destabilize a friendly nuclear power for a warlord in a valley, even if that warlord is telling the truth. Second, there was a profound cultural and diplomatic arrogance. Many in the State Department and Western foreign ministries saw Massoud through a flawed lens. One official reportedly told a French advocate for Massoud in 2000, "Look, we know the Saudis violate human rights, but we collaborate with them. Why would the Taliban be any different?" There was this belief that you could contain the Taliban, that they were just a bunch of rural conservatives who would eventually tire of ruling and become just another unsavory but manageable regime. They saw Massoud as a loser, a Tajik with no national constituency, a fundamentalist like all the others, just one who happened to be on the other side. They had no incentive to bet on the underdog when they thought they could manage the winner. In March of 2001, 5 months before 9/11, the Taliban did something so shocking that it briefly woke the world up. They destroyed the ancient Buddhas of Bamiyan. These were colossal statues carved into a cliff face in the 5th century. They weren't just Afghan heritage, they were world heritage. And the Taliban blew them up with dynamite and artillery. Why? Officially, it was about idolatry. Mullah Omar, the Taliban's reclusive leader, declared them idols that had to be destroyed. But when you look closer, it's more complicated. There were frantic last-ditch diplomatic efforts to save them. I recall a story about the French chargé d'affaires in Kabul at the time. He went to the Taliban foreign minister, Mutawakkil, and tried to appeal to reason. He suggested, "If you're afraid people will worship them, let us pay for curtains to cover them. Let us build a wall. Our people will donate the money. Mutawakil seemed receptive. He thought it was a good idea and said he would relay it to Mullah Omar. But later, we found out what really happened. When Mutawakil called Omar, the supreme leader scoffed at the idea. His reasoning reportedly was something like this. These foreigners are willing to spend millions of dollars to save these old stones while our people starve, and they won't lift a finger to help them. That is shameful. Destroy them. It wasn't just theology. It was a giant, defiant middle finger to the international community. It was a signal that they could not be bought, reasoned with, or controlled. They were proving a point. Your values mean nothing here. This event, the destruction of the Buddhas, was the straw that broke the camel's back, as Nicole Fontaine, the president of the European Parliament, later put it. It created enough political will to finally invite Massoud to address the European Parliament in April 2001. He came to Strasbourg. He came to Paris. He met with diplomats. He raised his pinky finger and told a French friend of mine through a translator that France hadn't given him a single Kalashnikov cartridge. He was pleading for practical help. He warned them that Osama bin Laden was planning something huge in the U.S. He didn't have the exact date or the method, but he had the strategic picture. And what did he get? Breakfast with the French foreign minister, Hubert Védrine. It was a hurried meeting, squeezed into a busy schedule. They treated him like a curiosity, not an ally with urgent, actionable intelligence. 2 days before 9/11, the bill came due. Al-Qaeda understood Massoud's importance better than the West did. They knew that in the aftermath of their planned attack, the United States would invade Afghanistan. They knew that if Massoud was alive, he would be the perfect partner for the Americans. He knew the terrain, he had the fighters, and he had the trust of the people in the North. He would have been an invaluable asset, potentially shortening the war and stabilizing the country afterwards. So bin Laden gave a gift to Mullah Omar, the assassination of the Lion of Panjshir. On September 9, 2001, two Arab men posing as journalists arrived at Massoud's headquarters in the Panjshir Valley. They had a fake Belgian passport and a camera that was actually a bomb. Fahim Dashti, one of Massoud's lieutenants, was there. He described how they sat down for the interview. They asked the usual questions about bin Laden and the Taliban. As the cameraman fiddled with his equipment, there was a blinding yellow flash. Dashti was wounded but survived. Massoud did not. The shrapnel from the bomb embedded in his chest. He died on the helicopter, taking him to a field hospital. 2 days later, the world changed forever. The connection between these two events is not a coincidence. It is a direct causal link. Al-Qaeda decapitated the Afghan resistance before launching their attack on America. They were tidying up the battlefield. When the U.S. invaded in October, they found a ready ally in the Northern Alliance, but it was a diminished force without its unifying leader. They still helped the U.S. topple the Taliban in a matter of months, but the deep strategic partnership that could have been the one that might have helped rebuild Afghanistan on a more stable footing was gone. Instead, we got the chaos of the last 20 years. The story of Massoud is a case study in the limits of realpolitik and the danger of managing threats. The U.S. and its allies, including France, had a binary choice. They could back a flawed but relatively moderate democratic-leaning resistance leader in Massoud, which would mean confronting their ally, Pakistan. Or they could try to manage the Taliban, hoping they would moderate while keeping the arms sales to Pakistan flowing. They chose the latter. They bet on the devil they thought they could do business with, and they lost that bet spectacularly. The Taliban didn't moderate. They harbored the group that attacked the U.S. The arms and money that flowed to Pakistan, some of it helped the Pakistani military, but a lot of it also helped sustain the environment that bred the Taliban and allowed them to equip themselves. I think about those French Milan anti-tank missiles that were found in abandoned al-Qaeda compounds after the invasion. How did they get there? Almost certainly via Pakistan. So by funding Pakistan and turning a blind eye to its support for the Taliban, Western countries were indirectly arming the very enemy Massoud was trying to stop. It was a perfect, tragic loop of unintended consequences. So where does that leave us? The personal failure that I feel when I look back at this history is a collective one. A Frenchman who was close to Massoud once told me that he considered his own inability to get his government to listen to personal failure. I understand that. But it's more than personal. It's a failure of imagination. We saw a man who was a military commander, a product of a brutal civil war, and we couldn't see past his rough edges to the strategic partner he could have been. We prioritize transactional relationships with a powerful state over a principled relationship with a struggling resistance. We listened to the intelligence but didn't act on it because acting would have been inconvenient. Whether this becomes a permanent scar on the history of Western foreign policy or a lesson that is finally learned depends on what happens in the coming years. As we watch the Taliban consolidate power and as new resistance movements form, we have to ask ourselves, are we really paying attention this time? Or will we, once again, only see the value of the warning after the bombs have gone off and the heroes are dead? Massoud's legacy is complicated. He wasn't a saint, but he was a leader who understood the threat before anyone else did. His story is a reminder that in geopolitics, the people who are most inconvenient to your existing strategy are often the ones you need to listen to the most. And when you ignore them, you don't just fail them, you fail yourself. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. It's a heavy story, but I think it's an important one to remember, especially right now. If you found this analysis useful, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and hit the notification bell. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was the West's failure to help Massoud a tragic mistake or an inevitable result of cold geopolitical calculus? I'm genuinely curious to hear your take. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.